of suicide awareness and prevention. As part of his lectures, he shares his inspiring story as a survivor of loss after losing his 15-year-old son, James, to suicide in 2010. Joe works with the Northeast Suicide Prevention Initiative, a local organization that promotes suicide awareness and prevention here in our community. And as a motivational speaker, Joe shares his courageous journey, the ability to survive pain with true resilience, and how he lives a life of gratitude and happiness for today, as he understands that tomorrow is not guaranteed. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. My screen is disabled. Brittany?
Oh, 1 second here. Should be good to go now.
All right, thank you. It is my honor to have been invited here today to speak to you about suicide awareness and prevention. However, you might be surprised to know it was not my choice to be here. My choice was made for me 10 years ago when my 15-year-old son, James, took his own life. I'd like to introduce you to my son, James. My son, James, had a love and passion for music. He was in 2 choirs and played 3 musical instruments. He was getting private singing lessons because his music teacher said that he had a good chance for a scholarship. My son had a love for helping people. He often listened to the other kids in his class, their problems, and he would help them when he could. Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know if I do this on my own will. Please do not think it was either one of your fault. I love you both very much. You've been great parents. Please tell anyone who asks why that I was in love with an amazing girl, but I screwed things up with her. Love forever and always, James. And on the back of his note, he said, give everything I have to Joseph. Joseph was his 6-year-old brother that he loved dearly. I've titled my speech today, Hiding Behind My Smile, because this is what we do. We hide behind our smile when we're simply having a bad day, or this is what a person will do. They will hide behind their smile the day they decide to take their own life. The imagery of the smiley face and the angry face pictorializes the confusion my son had and conflict in his mind the day he ended his life. How do I know this? Because I scanned these images in from the bottom of the suicide note I just read to you. Let me tell you a little bit about my story. My story started back in December of 1972. I was 7 years old. I remember my phone ringing that night. It was my grandfather Shalinsky calling to tell my mom that her younger brother Billy had taken his life. At 7 years old, how could I have known that that phone call would have repercussions in my life that I could never have imagined? Let's move ahead 38 years. The date is now February 23rd, 2010. Sadly, that night is when history was repeated for me, when my phone call came telling me that my 15-year-old son, James, had killed himself. At that point, my life completely stopped. I experienced an emotional trauma that I never understood existed. My brain was scrambled and nothing made sense to me anymore. I had difficulties doing simple tasks, just putting clothes out for the day, and sometimes I struggled just to put them on. It was about 3 weeks after losing my son when I began to feel that hope and my future was slipping away. My mind had felt like it was being covered with a wet, heavy wool blanket. Hope for me was disappearing. hope that I would ever be happy again, hope that someday I would enjoy doing the things that once brought me joy, hope that my life was worth living. I remember this day well, because this is the day I decided that I could no longer take this pain I was in. I just wanted to be with my son, James, and I wanted to die. I was having a conversation in my mind that was irrational about wanting to live and wanting to die. But the darkness of my grief was preventing me from thinking logically. I thought maybe I should call my friend Mike. No, I don't want Mike to think badly about me. Maybe I should call my Uncle Bob. He was close to me. No, I can't call my Uncle Bob. It was his brother that he lost his life 38 years earlier also. I then thought about my mom and dad and my older sister, Joelle, or my older daughter, Joelle. This is when I realized that if this is the kind of pain that I have from losing my son to suicide, then I could not give this pain to them. It's when I decided that this was my pain to carry and mine alone, and I had a decision to make. Was I going to let this pain destroy me and become more angry, more bitter, more resentful in life, that life had done me so wrong? Or was I going to stand up inside myself to find the courage, to find my anger and my fears that I had been living life that had brought me to that point of despair? I believe, ladies and gentlemen, it was only by the grace of God that helped me make the decision that day to make the right choice. Now, I'm here in front of you, a man that I never knew existed in my life. I have experienced days of happiness that I never thought possible at any time in my life. Now, you might be wondering, how did I go from having suicidal ideation to the man you see today? I'll come back to that. The topics I'd like to talk to you today about are stigma towards suicide, signs a person might be suicidal, what to do if you suspect someone might hurt themselves, how to approach them and how to support them, where to refer them, and what you should do if an employee or one of their family members takes their own life. I remember at one of my jobs that I had that we had an employee that was struggling with some personal issues. And the manager I worked for at the time was a really great guy. And I asked him if maybe we should sit down and talk to this person. And I was very surprised by his answer. He looked at me and he said, I just can't, and I don't know how. And I was very surprised by that. And I want to, by giving this discussion, I want to help people realize that it's not that difficult to talk to somebody, and it's not something that we should be afraid of, to talk to somebody when they are hurting and to be willing to help them. If we did not talk about high blood pressure, diabetes, or schizophrenia, cancer, where would we be? We'd be nowhere. But luckily, we do talk about those things, and there is no stigma associated with them. There is stigma, however, associated with suicide and mental health. Stigma is a mark that denotes shameful quality in an individual. The social stigma is prejudicial attitudes and discriminating behavior directed towards individuals with mental health problems. Society still looks at suicide as a taboo subject. Stigma words that are associated with suicide are words like cowardly, selfish, weak, and easy. Let me share with you a story about Dr. Benjamin Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer graduated magna cum laude from the University of Florida. Following there, he received an internship and residency in New York. After that, he was awarded a fellowship in sports medicine. Dr. Schaefer was the go-to sports guy in Washington, D.C. He was a masterful surgeon with countless academic publications. He trained orthopedic surgeons around the world. He was one of the top physicians for professional sports teams and Olympians. Dr. Schaefer's friends thought he had it all. Dr. Benjamin Schaefer was more than just a stellar surgeon. He was kind, he was brilliant, and he had a sensual soul that allowed him to connect with anyone from inner city children to Supreme Court justices. But most of all, Dr. Schaefer loved helping people. His patients will come to him in terrible pain, and they leave his office laughing and smiling. This is how he got the nickname, Dr. Smiles. Dr. Smiles was at the top of his game that day he ended his life. So why did he die? The night before Benjamin took his life, he knew he should check himself into a hospital, but he was panicked due to career ramifications due to the stigma associated with doctors seeking help for mental health. He was afraid that he would lose his practice, his patients, his marriage, and that everyone in the DC area would know about his mental health and he would be shunned. Dr. Schaefer was ashamed. He approached his business partners and told them that he needed the rest of the week off because he hadn't been sleeping well. His partners understood and said that they would cover for him. Dr. Schaefer left the hospital that night in sheer terror. He wanted to go back and tell his partners that he had changed his mind, but sadly, he did not. Dr. Schaefer's wife of 20 years recalled when Benjamin came home that night, he was awkwardly more loving. Dr. Schaefer slept through the night, but he woke up utterly exhausted. In the morning, on May 20th, 2015, he took his young son to school like he did most mornings. He went home and went into his office where he proceeded to end his life. Dr. Smiles was dead at the age of 59. I want to go back and repeat the part that he knew he should check himself into the hospital, but he was panicked due to career ramifications due to the stigma associated with doctors seeking help of mental health. So when we talk about stigma, we often think about other people and the stigma associated to mental health and suicide and how hard it is for us to confront these people. When in fact, the point of view about the stigma that is not often talked about is that if there was no stigma, Dr. Benjamin Schaefer would not have been afraid to reach out for help. Many people will not be afraid or embarrassed to reach out for help, and they may still be alive, including my son today. Misconceptions about suicide. Asking someone about suicide may plant the idea in their mind. This is something that many people are afraid of and is infactual. In fact, if a person is having chest pains, another person will not get those chest pains. So you can't put the idea in somebody else's mind about suicide or any other ailment that you get. People often attempt suicide without warning, out of the blue. In fact, most people who have taken their lives have had communicated intent before either doing it. Only crazy people attempt suicide. Fact, although most suicidal people are very unhappy, most suicidal acts are completed that aren't characterized as psychotic. Thus, they are generally rational and in touch with themselves. 75% of those attempted suicide, however, are clinically depressed. The tendency towards suicide is inherited and passed on from generation to generation. The fact is, since suicide often do run in family, the assumption is made that suicide is inherited. However, suicide often occurs in individuals with no family history of suicide. Suicides often do run in families, not because it's a genetic mutation, but it's from the powerful grief that they experienced, as I did, when I came to the realization that I too wanted to die. There are different levels of suicide risk. Low. A person may have some suicidal thoughts. They had no signs, no plan. They say that they will not attempt suicide. A person has suicidal thoughts, vague plan that isn't very well planned out. They say they won't attempt suicide. A person has suicidal thoughts. They have a specific plan that is highly lethal. They say they won't attempt suicide. Severe. A person has severe thoughts. There is a specific plan that is highly lethal. They say that they will attempt suicide. In 2018, the National Alliance for Suicide Prevention and the Action Alliance for American Foundation for Suicide Prevention commissioned the Harris Poll to conduct a public survey about suicide. These are some results. The Harris Poll surveyed 2,015 adults. 1 in 5 adults have suicidal thoughts. 1 in 10 have attempted suicide. These are astonishing numbers considering that the sample size was only 2,015 adults. You can't always see the pain, somebody that is thinking about suicide. There are warning signs, the suicidal thoughts, but they're not always easily seen. When a person is putting affairs in orders, they begin to withdraw from friends and family. Increased drug use or alcohol use helps in getting a person into a suicidal state. Giving away their possessions, anger, losing a sense of purpose, as I did, sudden mood changes, feeling of hopeless, helpless, and despair, as I did, change in sleep, anxiety or agitation, reckless behavior, talking about wanting to die or suicide is one of the important ones. You can help save a life by recognizing the signs and starting the conversation. Suicide is preventable. Worried about suicide? Let's learn the facts. Feelings. When a person is expressing hopelessness about the future. Actions. Displaying severe or overwhelming pain or distress. Change. Showing worrisome behavior, cues, or marked changes, including withdrawal from friends, family, change in social, acting hostile, or changing sleep. Threats. Talking about or making plans for suicide. Situations. Experiencing stressful situations, including those that involve loss, change, create personal humiliation. These kinds of situations can serve as triggers for suicide. 6 out of 10 say something would keep them from talking about suicide. These are barriers to talking about suicide with others. 20% of the people polled, I don't know the right words to say. 22%, I don't feel I have enough knowledge. 17%, I am not comfortable with this topic. 16%, fear of negative impact on me or my reputation. This particular number really troubles me. That 16% of the people surveyed had a fear of negative impact on themselves or their own reputation for simply trying to help somebody that they were worried about that wanted to commit suicide. That is how bad the stigma is towards suicide and a person with mental health. Once we get rid of the stigma, the more we talk about it, the more comfortable people will feel, the more lives will be saved. And 14%, I haven't had the opportunity to be in this situation. By the end of 2018 in the United States, sadly, there were 1,428,000 attempted suicides. On average, there are 132 suicides per day. Sadly, we lost 48,344 people to suicide. These numbers are staggering, and I hope that by making suicide and mental health more aware and openly talked about, that nobody else will have to go through the pain that the families do that have lost loved ones or friends to suicide. Some actions for dealing with someone who is thinking about suicide. Offer to listen to their concerns. Listening is one of the hardest things that we can do when someone is telling us about how they want to die. It makes us very uncomfortable, and we want to interject our own personal feelings or beliefs, when in fact, we need to just listen and make them felt heard. Encourage them to seek help from their doctor or mental health professional. Help them, make them, take them to an appointment to their primary care or mental health professional. This one to me is, I think a lot of people in our busy lives feel that they don't have time to do this. I don't know how we cannot make time for another human being that is in that type of stress and that type of situation. Or we can simply stay with them until we can get help for them. Making that person know that somebody does love them and that they are important is very important to somebody in that state of mind. If you feel someone might hurt themselves, these are things not to do. Don't argue with them. Avoid saying things like, "You have much to live for." Don't act shocked. Avoid lecturing on the value of life or telling them that suicide is a waste. Don't offer ways to fix their problems. Don't give advice or make them feel like they have to justify their suicidal feelings. It's not about how bad the problem is, but how badly it is hurting them. And don't blame yourself. You can't fix somebody else's depression. That person's happiness or lack thereof is not your responsibility. Here are some things to do if you feel someone might be at the state of wanting to hurt themselves. Simply be yourself. Let that person know you care, that they are not alone. Show them that they are important to you. Listen. Let that person vent, unload their feeling. No matter how negative the conversation seems, the fact is that it's taking place, and that is a positive sign. Be sympathetic. The suicidal person is doing the right thing by talking about their feelings, no matter how difficult it may be to hear. Offer hope. Reassure that person that help is available and that the suicidal feelings are temporary. Let that person know that their life is important to you and important to others. And most importantly, please take that person seriously. If that person is saying things like, I am so depressed, I can't go on, ask if they're having thoughts of suicide. You're allowing them to share their pain with you. You are not putting ideas in their head. Here are some organizations that are suicide related. We have the crisis text line. The Veterans Crisis Line is really good for service members. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is a great international organization. Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a very good organization that can help immediately by getting somebody on the phone. And Northeast Suicide Prevention Initiative. These folks have helped me greatly. I've had the blessing to work with them. The money donated to the Northeast Suicide Prevention Initiative goes to supporting local organizations that need help and advertising and getting the word out. Do you have a plan? Know what to do if an employee or one of their family members takes their own life? Inform. Provide prompt, accurate information to coworkers. Refrain from discussing or sensationalizing details of the suicide or suicide attempt. Triggering. Understanding that reaction to a suicide will vary significantly. Some employees may not have even known the deceased, may become overcome with emotion, while others who were close to employees may appear to be unaffected. We all handle trauma and mourn in different ways, and we can't be judgmental in these times of crisis. And we need to be aware. Recognize that employee or managers may also have feelings of guilt and grief related to a suicidal death or attempt and should be supported. How can we make suicide preventable? Don't use the phrase committed suicide. Instead, say died by suicide. When we're going to start changing the stigma around suicide, we have to start using different language. When a person commits a crime, that's why we don't say committed suicide, because they didn't commit a crime. Instead, we change the wording. We say died by suicide. We can remove the stigma associated to suicide the more we openly talk about it and not be embarrassed. I remember I gave a speech and I asked a good friend of mine what he thought about my speech. And he kind of hemmed and hawed like men often do about expressing how they feel. And he said, you know, you shared some personal things about yourself that I probably wouldn't have shared. I looked at him and I said, you know, you're right, I did. But I did it with the intention of helping somebody else not experience the pain that I went through. And the embarrassment was no longer. Getting educated and learning to recognize the warning signs. Don't be afraid to help somebody you are concerned about. You are not doing anything wrong. You are simply showing them love. When we as a society stop to listen to stories like mine and others who have lost a loved one to suicide, we are letting the people who have died, who couldn't speak for themselves, be the actual drivers of change. Now you might be wondering, how did I go from being in a suicidal ideation state to experiencing happier days in my life than I ever thought possible for myself? I had to realize that everything in my life that I believed about life and myself had brought me to that darkest hour on that day. And I had to be open to changing. And the first thing I did is I turned to God for his help and guidance and his love. The next I never lived by a motto before, and now I live by a motto. And my motto is simply this: if I can help enough other people get what they want, I will get what I want. And simply put, this motto is, the more I give, the more I will get in return. Now, you might be wondering how Henry Ford and the 1929 Model A Roadster have anything to do with suicide prevention. Let me share a story with you. When I was 14 years old, my father collected antique cars, and he had this particular car itself. He told me, son, never sit in the car and shift the gears. It's not good for the car. Well, I was 14, and I went in the garage one day, and I got in the car, and I was shifting the gears, and I was driving all over town, even though I had not left the garage. And my father came home early that day, and instead of being mad at me, he climbed in the passenger seat, and he sat there next to me, and he was telling me about Henry Ford and what a brilliant man he was about inventing the Model T and the Model A. And then he asked me something that I never forgot. He asked me a question. He said, son, do you know how intelligent Henry Ford was? And I said, no, Dad, I didn't. He said, Henry Ford was so smart, it was beyond amazing. Son, do you know why Henry Ford created the windshield of the car so big and the rearview mirror so small? I said, no, Dad, I don't. He said, Henry Ford wants you to pay attention to your future, where you are going in life, instead of where you've been. When we spend time looking at our past and living in our past, we become depressed and sad. But Henry Ford made the rearview mirror so small that he did not want us to stay there and live there. He didn't want us to forget where we were, but he wanted us to not forget, but leave the pain behind and focus on a compelling future moving forward. Additional things that I started doing for myself was to love myself. Now, when I ask people if they love themselves, they often look at me with a very strange look on their face, because this is something that we don't talk about very often. People will say often, I eat healthy and I exercise, and that is part of loving yourself. But it wasn't the part of loving yourself that I'm talking about. First of all, I realized that I had to start lowering the volume of my inner critic. We all have an inner critic. And for me, the volume of my inner critic was very loud. Our inner critic are the things that we hear in our mind, that I'm not smart enough, I'm too tall, I'm too short, I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I'm ugly, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough. For me, lowering the volume of my inner critic has helped me greatly in living a happier and more fulfilled life. Second, I learned to realize that I was valuing other people's opinion of me more than I valued my own opinion of me. Please tell anyone who asks why that I was in love with an amazing girl, but I screwed things up with her. From my son's suicide note. Do you think my son valued that girl's opinion of him more than he valued his own opinion of him? And it's sadly to believe that he did. And it's a trap that we fall into. But when we learn to value our own opinion of ourselves more than we value other people's opinion of us, we will become much happier. Now, we can do this in a very humbling way. We don't need to become arrogant or egotistical to value our own opinion. Third, I had to start to have compassion and forgiveness for myself. See, if you and I are walking down the sidewalk and you happen to trip, I would kneel down and pick you up and say, it's okay. You just tripped on the sidewalk. You made a simple mistake. Now the conversation that used to be in my head, as if I did the same thing, would have been, how stupid am I? I'm 55 years old and I don't know how to walk. I don't know how to pick up my feet. So I had to start giving myself the compassion and the forgiveness that I would give others. The more I start to love myself, the more I'm able to love other people better. Guilt and regrets. The pain from guilt and regrets become like an anchor. They trap us in the harbor of sadness, despair, and depression. We become stuck, so we can't move on or move forward in life. I had to start looking at my guilts and regrets differently. Instead, we should treat guilt and regrets like visitors in the guest house of our minds. We can send them on their way, just like those in-laws that overstay their welcome. But I'm sure there's nobody out here that have had in-laws overstay their welcome. These are some of the things that I have done to help change from wanting to die to become working towards the man that God had originally intended me to be. My son James and I want to remind you that suicide is preventable with your help. Thank you.
I'm still on mute, I'm sorry. Wow, Joe, that was very, very great information. You had me in tears a couple times. I know one of the things for me, it was, that was eye-opening is that sometimes you don't really know the right words to say, and I think that's certainly true. So anyway, I'm gonna cry again. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to say?
So I'd like to invite anyone who has any additional questions to type them into the chat box. While we wait for those, Joe, we had a few questions come in during registration. So I'll just run through those quickly if you don't mind.
Sure.
The first one was, do you have any constructive ways to address signs of depression in ourselves and others?
That's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question. We become comfortable in our sadness as well as our happiness, and it is hard for us to recognize that. We have to start becoming self-aware of what we are thinking about and how our thoughts do affect us. Before all of this, I was never self-aware of what I would think about or even the words that I would say. And the words that I speak to myself are very powerful now. And when I listen to the words, when I hear myself with my inner critic putting myself down, I make a correction because I no longer want to talk that way, because I know the power of allowing my inner critic to have a louder volume in my head than I currently do.
Great. Our next question, do you have any tips for battling our depression due to what we're all going through right now, being physically disconnected from others and pretty much staying at home?
When we try and keep up with the Joneses is a major problem. And when we can't keep up with the Joneses and we can't connect with the Joneses, we most of us like to be socially connected because we need the connection of other people. But when we learn to connect with ourselves, and this sounds silly, but in psychology, we can learn to get the same connection from other people that we can learn to connect with ourselves. And when we don't have any connection with anybody, not including ourselves, this is what we can destructively make a connection with ourselves by overeating or over drinking. And so learning to realize that we do need a connection, but how can we positively create a connection with ourselves? And Jeff, I talked to you a little bit about meditation. I know people aren't very open to meditation, and I never was. But there are two ways that we can learn in life. One is when we do our best learning in our time of need and despair, which I did. And then the second way is I say, why do we need to wait for our time of need or time of despair? We can learn it now. So being open to learning, how can I make a connection with myself, whether it's journaling, meditating, the way I talk to myself. If I had not gone through the deepest, darkest hours of my life that I have, I would not be prepared for this situation now. And so it's better to be prepared for a situation and not have one, instead of having a situation and not being prepared. So we have two choices. We can wait for that time of disparity, or we can learn and be open to growing on how I can be happy with myself and not needing to be keeping up with the Joneses and doing what they do and needing their attention.
Those are some really great tips.
Joe, we just had someone submit a question. I don't know if you can see it as well, but this viewer had a cousin who died by suicide, and the family never talks about it, but his presence is missed at family gatherings such as weddings. Everyone feels awkward mentioning his name, but his mother really laughed and shared from stories from childhood. Her question is, should family members bring his name up, or is it too painful for the cousin's parents? Should they celebrate his memory or not talk about him?
That's a very good question. And one of the hardest things as a parent to lose a child, and for a family member to lose a child, is that we don't want that person to be forgotten. So when we don't talk about that person, even though it may be painful, it is more painful when we feel that people have forgotten about the person that we lost. And one more thing, if I can give that advice, I was asked the question prior, if I ask a question about a loved one that somebody lost, and they are sad and upset and they are crying, what should I do? And I tell them to be uncomfortable and let that person finish their thoughts. Because for me, when I had to cry and I had to get things out, even if it took me 5 minutes to say whatever it was that I needed to say, that person that I was trying to talk to, I know it made them feel very uncomfortable, but that was the best thing for me, was to be able to cry and get it out and say it.
Great, thanks. Joe, you shared with me 2 resources that we'll also post links to on our website. One of them being a manager's guide to suicide in the workplace and 10 action steps for dealing with the aftermath of suicide. As we all are working virtually, or many of us are working virtually, do you have any tips for, if you have a coworker that you feel may be struggling, or you may be worried that could be suicidal, given that we aren't in a physical location working together, many of us?
It's interesting that we've lost an old way of communication that is more powerful than instant messenger, than chat, and even more powerful than the telephone. Is that if you wrote that person a letter telling them what you thought about them, about their good qualities, why people love them, why people love being around them. When we get a physical letter, it is so much more meaning than the instant gratification from a text message, even a phone call. Because once we hang the phone up, we only have that in our mind. But if I have a physical letter of a few paragraphs of somebody telling me how special I am and how I have helped make them feel in a situation, I will have that back to look at and reference when I have nobody else around. So it might be a little more work, but a letter carries a very powerful message.
We have about 10 minutes left. I encourage you to keep typing your questions into the chat box if you have any. Another one we have is, you mentioned meditation. Someone asked about remaining focused when they're surrounded by all these stressors in the world. Maybe you could speak some more about your philosophy on meditation and practical ways to approach that.
For me, as I talked to Jeff the other day, it's very hard for me to meditate by myself. So I find guided meditation easier to stay focused. And there are several different good methods to use as a guided meditation. Now, not everybody is good for everybody. You need to find somebody that you can connect with and relate. Women may not connect with me giving a guided meditation, but there are good women. Louise Hay is one of the women that I've even listened to. She gives a great meditation on loving yourself. And so going out on YouTube is where actually I started learning about positive messages. And people have asked me, do positive messages really help? And do they last? And I said, no, they don't last, but neither does bathing. And I'm sure everybody's glad I took a shower today. So there is so much negativity that we get bombarded with every day that we have to keep our mind fed with positive messages. So often, sometimes what I will do, I will listen to a positive message, I will read a section of the Bible, and I will watch the news. And that way, I know what both sides are doing.
Another question we have, you mentioned how to interact with someone and some tips when you think someone may be suicidal. But the question is, do you continue to interact with them one-on-one, or is there a point where you should get others involved, whether that be a supervisor at work or another family member?
It is always good to get somebody else involved, because we all have a level of knowledge. And for me, going through what I went through, when I worked at a company for 20 years, we had 3 other families lose children to suicide. And it may sound silly, but there were times that I did not know what to say to them. So it is best, if you are uncomfortable and not certain about what to say to somebody, even if you're just there, to pass on the message or get help from somewhere else.
Another question someone submitted when registering. Do you have any tips for how we address the high anxiety levels of students once they go back to school?
So using the analogy of the Model A car, when we focus in the past, we are sad, depressed, because we focus on bad things. But when we focus too far into the future, we begin to worry about negative outcomes in our life. And that's where we get anxiety from. So when we focus on the future, we have to be careful of our inner critic and learn to be aware when our inner critic is not serving us, because it never does serve us. When focusing on the future, we have to be positive and say, I'm going to make the best out of online class if that's what it takes this fall to get through. I don't like online learning, but if that was my only option, I'm going to make the best out of it as I can and do the best that I could, and not beat myself up if I didn't get as good a grade as I would as in person. Let's not forget having compassion and forgiveness for ourselves. if we worry about things, that does not serve us in a good way. But even if we are worried, to have compassion, understanding, and forgiveness about, hey, you know what? It's okay. Reach out to somebody. Again, if there is no stigma associated to any of these problems that we talk about, and if you reach out to somebody and somebody makes fun of you or laughs, they're not a friend. They're not anybody that you should have in your life. There are people that will talk to you.
It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in, but as we wrap up this webinar, Joe, we talked about this slate of webinars being held in honor of May being Mental Health Month, and you are our last presenter for the month. So as we wrap up, do you have any last minute thoughts or tips or anything to say to the attendees just about the importance of mental health?
Cancer is one of the scariest words on the planet, but mental health should be just as scary. But if more we talk about mental health, just as a cancer, we can cure cancer in most cases. With mental health, we can cure mental health situations, but we can't be afraid of talking about it, addressing it, and being open to the possibilities of doing something new to correct my mental health problems, my inner critic, my negative attitude. Those are all bad things that lead up to a negative mental health problem. Being open to say, when we get sick and tired of being sick and tired, there's often when we'll seek help. And as I mentioned before, why wait till our time of despair? Let's start to take baby steps on working on our mental health now to stay strong and resilient in times that we really need it.
Thanks. I think that's an awesome way to wrap up the month. As we mentioned before, we will be posting this recording on the Scranton Area Foundation YouTube channel, as well as links on the Moses Taylor Foundation website. And as I mentioned, Joe did send me a few resource manuals that I will also be posting the links of. So thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Joe, for presenting. And everyone have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care,
Joe,
guys.
that was really outstanding. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, we can do this.